Hello, and welcome to the Kongversation. I'm Hyle Russell.
And I'm Josh Wallen.
Oh, Josh, how are you doing, buddy?
Oh, I'm doing good.
Really? Really?
Oh, no. No, I actually am. It's been a good time for me lately. I finished my season about a week ago, and since then I've been on vacation mode. Actually, God, it's been about 2 weeks now, hasn't it, man?
What's that like? I don't even know. Congratulations on finishing your season. The Geek Critique, by the way, check it out on the YouTubes. This is the worst time of year for me. I don't hate the holiday season, but inevitably I end up resenting the holiday season because by the time we hit December 23rd, 24th, whatever, I am a withered husk. I am just beaten down into submission, and I got a lot on my plate anyway, outside of just the usual DK Vine stuff, but I'm also trying to get, all this content out and, keeping up with the conversation. And, big YouTubers have decided to make Donkey Kong December a thing, Josh. And as somebody who talks about Donkey Kong and the Donkey Kong universe every day of the year, I suddenly feel immense guilt that I'm not doing more in the month of December, the busiest, most stress-inducing month of the year, to keep up with this artificial metric of, it's Donkey Kong December, something that a big YouTuber with millions of subscribers or whatever has made up, and we should all jump and dance to it. And
well, for YouTubers in particular, I mean, December's always a very I think YouTubers will always want to put out lots of content in December because around the holidays, ad revenue is up. It's a very lucrative time. The thing is, with the kind of content that some of us make, you have to start working on whatever you're going to put out in December in about July. That's what I did anyway. So for me, it's more like the stress is all behind me now,
Yeah. Well, I'm also like, why am I trying to compete with all these people in December to talk about Donkey Kong when I'm going to be here talking about Donkey Kong in January and February and March and April? Like,
our love for Donkey Kong cannot be contained to merely 1 out of 12 months.
It's not conditional to this just because it's alliteration. I'm not going to play this game, people. So yeah, no, DK Vine isn't acknowledging Donkey Kong December because it's not a thing, because it's Donkey Kong 24/7 365 here at DK Vine. So blow me, I don't care.
Having said that, I do want to give a shout out and in fact a plug to my fellow YouTuber Designing 4.
Yes.
Speaking of things that you started working on in July, he told me that he started working on this in July. It's, so the original joke with Donkey Kong December, which was started by Video Game Donkey, was that he was going to make a Donkey Kong video every single day in December.
Oh.
And then he did not actually do that. And that was the joke.
Okay.
So that was last year.
I'm not up on things, Josh. I'm in my own bubble, usually because I'm so busy, spinning all the plates for DK Vine. Because it'd be one thing if I was just making YouTube content, but I'm not. I'm like trying to do a little bit of everything, and it kills me. And and therefore, like I'm a master of no domain. I'm just trying to keep up with everything. A little bit of content over here, a little bit of content over there as I wipe the flop sweat from my forehead. But yes, Designing 4, I'm actually familiar with. They're actually a Kongversation listener. They're familiar with DK Vine, and they actually consulted me for a Diddy Kong video. A while back ago. So I do recommend their content. It's been pretty great, but
yeah, they actually are putting out daily Donkey Kong videos all throughout the month of December.
Yeah.
And told me that they did indeed start working on that project in July, because that's what you gotta do.
Yeah. So anyway, all this being said, I hate December. But, I hope everyone is having a nice holiday season, regardless of my own bitterness. I do genuinely hope everyone can find a little peace and solitude for this winter solstice. And we are
I know it's stressful. We were out at a department store a couple hours ago, and there was this woman with that alone. There was this woman with 2 children. Of course, it was busy as fuck, but there was this woman with 2 children, and one of them dropped her cup and spilled it on the floor, and then picked it up. And the mother there just made this expression she was too tired to even be angry about it. Mm-hmm. And I was like, man, I remember my parents giving me that look. Jeez.
Yeah. I just want to be in a cabin in the forest somewhere. I just want to be away from it all. But DK Vine's going to be here through the end of the year with Kongversations and other surprises. Dustin is working on our holiday card again, and we'll be unveiling that within a few days, actually. So we're gonna be festive. We're gonna be putting on our celebratory elfin suits, but
we're gonna be putting in the Merry code on the file select screen.
I'm not doing that on my DK Vine done slow run of DKC3 because I was like, I just want to experience the green bananas and the stars as is. I don't need any more Christmas shoved in my face, but we're gonna be festive. Don't worry. With the next week or so, we are going to have a lot of holiday fun here at DK Vine, and I want.
If you keep this up, some spirits are going to visit you in the middle of the night and teach you the true meaning of the season. Hyle, you better be careful.
If it's Wrinkly Kong and the Ghost Riders and Ramsey the Pirate Lord, then you know what? Let them come. We'll have some fun. I think, this will be a nice episode to be a backdrop to everyone's holiday travels or gift wrapping or decorating or cookie baking or whatever the hell you're doing. I hope this episode will be that for you. Because we're going to be talking about, I don't even know if this is a controversial topic. I don't know anymore, Josh. I announced this. I announced this topic on social media the other day, and people got angry because they misread what I was saying. They thought we were coming after the N64, and of course, this episode is entitled "In Defense of the Nintendo 64." So we are not doing that. We are not attacking the N64. We are going to be addressing what we both feel like is sort of become a bit of revisionist history in the last couple of years in online discourse when it comes to the Nintendo 64. We're going to get into all of it and explain what we mean and why the N64 needs defending.
Yeah, but, I relate to you so well when you say, I don't know if this is a controversial opinion or not. Because, that's one of the things about being on the internet for, decades at this point, is that we've kind of seen different things turn in and out of the discourse to the point that we kind of remember, okay, this was the consensus at one time. Is it still?
Right. And
I have no idea.
If you're on an episode of the Kongversation, generally we're touching upon the notion of these generational divides in the fandom and how perspectives can differ even within 5 years age difference between people. And how as people come of age, you get new majority opinions kind of filtering out older opinions and how everything just becomes sort of muddled. And so with clarity of vision, we are going to be attacking this topic head on. As people who lived through the 1990s and have a clear recollection of what happens, I think we are fully qualified to talk about this. And no, the Geek Critique and DK Vine are not going to attack the N64. We're not going to coddle it either, but this is just, we're doing this episode because we feel like we have to set the record straight as best we can.
Yes. Yeah. No, it's kind of funny because sometimes I hear people say things that seem to imply that, like, people like us, like, I guess, quote-unquote 90s kids, just aren't around at all anymore. or that we never say anything.
Yeah.
And I'm like, I'm still here, you know.
Yeah. I don't know. I feel like it's because older millennials generally aren't online as much as we are. Like, see, here's the thing. I'm technically an older millennial, right? But I've always
and I am right in the dead center of of what's called the millennials.
But the problem is, I've always been sort of like suffering from Arrested Development. I've always sort of been 5 years younger than my biological age would say. So I am sort of one of those older millennials that grew up later. I was a late bloomer. So because of that, I can give you the perspective of someone who may not be online anymore, with all of the fresh-faced dewiness of a person 5 years younger than me. So
well, I believe I'm 5 years younger than you. So.
Well, there you go. There we go.
Yeah.
We're practically twins. Before we get into it, though, Josh, I do want to plug our wares, rare or not. So really quick, as is customary in late 2022, I need to plug DK Vine's Mastodon account.
Pterodactyl!
Because I can't plug it on Twitter anymore, apparently.
Oh, yeah, that's true. I saw that.
So, DK Vine is on Mastodon, so if you're looking for an alternative to Twitter, rest assured I am... Well, I wasn't for about a week, because Mastodon, or at least the Mastodon server I'm on, they did a database migration, which caused us to lose half of our followers on Mastodon, and also, like, half of our post. But,
still better than the alternative.
Yeah, I've just resumed posting on Mastodon after a hiatus over the weekend and into, like midweek when I was still waiting for, like, are my posts going to come back? Are my followers going to come back? But we are on Mastodon, and I'm putting all of what would be our Twitter content is also getting reposted on Mastodon. So if you don't want to support whatever mad boy emerald mine apartheid error is losing his mind in real time, then you can, go to dkvine.com/Mastodon, or just find us on Mastodon. It's mastodon.stf.org or whatever. I don't know.
Or something like that.
Something like that.
Also, that reminds me, it hasn't been said in a long time, but it needs to be said. We will not be taking any hotline questions about apartheid. Just want to throw that out there.
Right. So, anyway, follow us on Mastodon. You will get the same content you do on Twitter. And as of a couple of hours ago, Hive's back online too. So we're also on Hive. If you're on Hive was down for 2 weeks.
Oh my God, was it?
Yeah, it suffered complete colony collapse, but it's been repopulated. Whatever security issues were at play have apparently been solved. So I will be also cross-posting on Hive for as long as this is feasible. I think Mastodon is taking the lead as far as Twitter alternatives, but Hive is back in the running at least. So we will we'll see on both. Whatever you want, you can follow us on Mastodon or Hive. I'm not on Post yet. We'll see, but yeah.
Follow the DK Vine Zanga.
I am running a contest, too, to try to boost our followers on both platforms. So if you follow us on Mastodon and or Hive, you will be entered eventually to win an official fan gamer googly eye pin that they put out for Banjo-Kazooie. It's official rare merchandise. These have been discontinued. I have the last two available. And I will be awarding one of them to somebody who follows us on Mastodon and one of them to somebody who follows us on Hyle. But because both platforms have suffered a bit in the last 2 weeks, I have held off on an end date for this contest. I don't know when it's going to be. It was originally going to be like last Monday, but then everything went to shit for both. So to be determined, but just follow us on either Mastodon or Hive. You might have to refollow us on Mastodon if you already followed us. But yeah, you'll be entered to win one of these googly eye pins, which you can no longer get from Fangamer. And well, who wouldn't want that? We're trying to get eyes on these new social media accounts, Josh. So therefore, we will be giving out eyes.
And if you win, you can use that to turn anything into like a living organism.
That's right. That's right. So, except the flaming wreckage of your Tesla. So anyway, Mastodon and Hive, follow us on both. And I hate to plug this during a season where everybody is financially strapped, but DK Vine's on Patreon. And I just want to thank all of our patrons, whether they be regular or irregular. It really does make the difference in keeping the lights on and it keeps the dream of DK Vine alive. Look, I'm not making much money from this. I'm breaking even essentially, but it still allows me to keep plugging away. Eventually, I would like to, make enough from DK Vine where I don't need to do side hustles. I don't need to, work the streets, but
Wait, what?
Forget. Don't worry about it, Josh. But then maybe I could do videos every day for Donkey Kong December. Who knows? But
Christmas wears you out more than I thought. Jeez.
Yeah, I'm actually a mall Santa. No, I'm a mall Santa's helper. It's not even that great.
I think you'd have the spirit that, like, in spirit, you would be very good at that. But the problem is you would get very upset at all the children who didn't want Donkey Kong universe-related gifts.
Right. And then I would explain to them, no, don't worry, Conquer is part of the Donkey Kong universe. And they would just stare at me stone-faced.
You don't want V-Bucks. You want a Nintendo 64.
Anyway, yeah, thank you to our patrons. If you have thought about supporting DK Vine on Patreon, check us out in the new year. dkvine.com/Patreon. Every little bit.
Yeah, honestly, thank you to all patrons everywhere. I know firsthand I would not be able to do what I do without Patreon either. So yeah, it really does make a difference.
It's been like night and day since we started the Patreon. It just makes it possible, and I wouldn't be able to produce the Kongversation as much as I do. It borders on actually being a career rather than just a hobby. So thank you to our patrons, and the more patrons we get, the more we can make that dream a reality. Let's make it happen in 2023, everyone. Thank you. And Josh, really quick, the Geek Critique. You just finished your season. What can subscribers to the Geek Critique on YouTube? What kind of content can they watch? Can they be entertained by?
Oh, well, it's a 4-episode season with 3 of the 4 episodes are out now. The newest one just came out today, actually, as this is being recorded. And the last one will be out on Friday the 23rd. It's a 4-episode season covering some of the more obscure Sonic games, some of the more I guess forgotten ones to a certain extent. That seems to be sort of a theme of the season, but it's Sonic Rush and Sonic Rush Adventure for the Nintendo DS, and then Sonic and the Secret Rings and Sonic and the Black Knight for the Wii. And half of those games were actually some of the very, very few Sonic games that I had never beaten before, and in fact, in one case, I had never even played it before I started this season. So it sort of takes a different format to a lot of the Sonic episodes, where I'm actually sort of taking you through the experience of me experiencing this game for the first time.
Yeah.
And, like when I wrote the scripts for them, I would I'd play a couple of levels, I'd play a while, then I'd come back and give my thoughts just on that section. So like, it's a very, I guess, focused look at each of those games.
So you say there's some of the more obscure and forgotten Sonic games.
Yeah.
What would be the Donkey Kong equivalent to them?
Well, given the time period, I guess it would be things like the buyout era games. Like Barrel Blast, even Jungle Beat to a certain extent, really.
Yeah, Jungle Beat's weird because it is effectively the mainline console game of that generation, but a lot of people just treat it like it's a spin-off or a side game. And I'm like, no, that was the Donkey Kong game of that era. I mean, but people think it's Donkey Konga or some derivative of Donkey Konga because of the bongos. So
yeah, I think if Jungle Beat hadn't had a name that made, like, honestly, if you didn't know, like, if say you hear about Donkey Konga, and like, you know, you're not like those. Lots of people were making fun of the barrel, the bongo drum peripherals, so you're not really gonna forget that. But then, like, a year later, you hear about Donkey Kong Jungle Beat, you're just gonna think that's Donkey Konga again.
I mean, this was discussed earlier this season, wasn't it? So
I believe it was. Yeah,
yes.
I feel like that. There's a reason this is on the tip of my brain. So,
yeah. I was just wondering because when I think of obscure Donkey Kong games, obviously I live and breathe this. So for me, an obscure Donkey Kong game would be something like Donkey Kong Country Barrel Maze. It would be something that people don't even trust the validity of it existing in the first place, but. Yeah, if it was out on the Wii or whatever, then I don't think it could be as obscure as a Shockwave game from 2003.
Yeah, jeez. With ska music, I love that.
All right, well...
It's always what I think of.
Yeah, Josh, here we go again. Whenever you're on the show, it's an event. It's a treat. But we tend to get... philosophical. We tend to get weighty, and we tend to reflect on our own mortality a bit whenever you're on the show, because we do. That's
been a theme that for better and worse I've focused on a lot over the past few years. Yeah,
and I mean, full disclosure, we have been talking about doing this episode since September. You first approached me with just this quibble. You came at me and was like, hey, have you noticed this? And I was like, yeah, I noticed it. And it's like, why don't we do a podcast about it? All right, when do you want to do it? I don't know, December. And so here we are. We are discussing at the crux of this. This is nothing more than just, like I said, the generational divide between gamers and how it's usually just a matter of your own childhood anchoring your perspective. That's all this is. That's all this ever is. But I mean, we are basically old men at this point, Josh, but we're not like old men.
Well, speak for yourself, elder millennial.
All right, but we're not like Cranky Kong old men where we're complaining about the youth. We're here to meet the youth halfway. We're here to say, hey, maybe your perspective is a bit off here. I understand it, but let's try to meet in the middle and come to a consensus about why you think the way you do, why we think the way we do, and let's bring in some stats. Let's bring in some facts. And let's all grab some drinks afterward, if you're old enough to drink. So,
oh God, if you are, yeah, like, and I don't want that to be like patronizing, because the truth of the matter is, through this whole process, what it's really caused me to do over the past couple of years is actually reevaluate my perspectives on a lot of this stuff, because so much of it is like, I see people younger than me saying the same things that I remember people older than me saying, and that I remember feeling when I was that age. Mm-hmm. So it's kind of like, it kind of feeds into this thing where I'm like, why do I really believe what I thought I believed, and like, how valid was it really? And not saying, and that's not saying I'm gonna like disavow it or stop believing it, but just let me reevaluate my perspective on this.
Yeah. And this is an episode that we probably wouldn't have done 6 to 7 years ago, because 6 to 7 years ago, I would argue, was pretty much the height of 1990s nostalgia, and therefore Nintendo 64 nostalgia. I mean, you might slide that time scale up or down a little bit, but, time refuses to stand still. And I would argue that we're now at the cusp or the early years of early aughts nostalgia, early to mid aughts nostalgia. Just as the 90s kids came of age a while back ago and began to reclaim the narrative of our childhood. Now the GameCube generation and maybe the early Wii generation are doing the same. And, their narrative, is honestly a similar narrative to the narrative that we were combating in the early 2000s, except now it's basically the myths and stories that were prevalent when the 2000s came into vogue and displaced 1990s culture. And now it's being refrained from this nostalgic bent, but it's just this tug of war that keeps going back and forth throughout the years. And I don't know. I think it's amusing to me that, if you live long enough, you eventually see the same battles come back. And,
yeah.
it was a great feeling, right? Because around 2010, I would say, a lot of the nonsense of the 2000s started to fall by the wayside. Nonsense like Donkey Kong Country is overrated, and people only liked it for the graphics. And a lot of that just fell by the wayside when people who grew up with Donkey Kong Country and genuinely loved it entered the industry and the media and started to have more of an outsized voice through content creation.
I saw somebody a while back who was watching, I don't remember, this was quite a while ago now, I don't remember exactly what they were looking at. I think they were watching a top 10 list that was made in 2006 or something.
Uh-huh.
And that top 10 list was itself pushing back on the idea that Donkey Kong Country wasn't a brilliant game in its own right. And that didn't even make sense to them. They didn't even know that there was ever such a strong, that was the consensus in the discourse at that time.
Yeah. And I mean, with Donkey Kong Country, it wasn't just Donkey Kong Country, it was, Rare itself never made any quality games, sans GoldenEye, and everybody who made GoldenEye left, and they were the ones who were good, and it kind of filtered a little bit to the Nintendo 64 itself. The Nintendo 64 was a mistake in every way, and now obviously people weren't gonna ever gun for things like Ocarina of Time, or even Super Mario 64 to an extent, but just by and large, it just, the N64 was a blight. Now, what's changed is that we now have people from that era who came of age during that era, or, were at the prime of their childhood during that era, who are maybe reframing these narratives, but also talking up the GameCube, because the GameCube is what they grew up with. And, I think this is becoming sort of secondhand wisdom in some corners of the internet, and obviously not within the bulk of our own audiences, Geek Critique and DK Vine. I think mostly our audiences, even if they didn't grow up during the era of the N64, they will be, into that era enough through osmosis or through their own cultural curiosity, and they're not going to be dismissive of it. But there are some very popular YouTubers out there who far exceed DK Vine's popularity and even your own popularity, Josh. You're far more popular on YouTube than we are, but these are mammoths, not mastodons, mammoths on YouTube. And I feel like this narrative is a hyperbolic one, and it like I said, it feels more like secondhand wisdom.
And I think I want to be clear about that. We're not arguing that this narrative is being said out of like some sense. Basically, it's not somebody trying to push a narrative because they have an agenda and they're intentionally trying to demean anything in particular. It's just like you said at the top of the discussion. It's like the perspective. Let me just go in on this because this is
Okay.
I feel like I'm walking around this instead of just going right in on it. And this is something that you and I discussed back in September. There's this little up and coming YouTuber. I think he has a couple million subscribers called Scott the Woz.
Yeah.
And I love Scott the Woz, actually. I think he does fantastic work. He's a freaking workhorse. He deserves everything he's gotten. And he's been very, very kind to me personally as well. So, this is not me throwing shade at Scott the Woz. But what I noticed and what I thought was kind of funny is I was looking like through his channel a while back, and I noticed that he's made a video, like he's made 2 videos on the GameCube. They're called Nintendo GameCube, Shaping a Generation, and GameCube Was Best. And then he's also made one video on the Nintendo 64. It says, Nintendo 64, Nintendo's Best Mistake. And what kind of struck me about that is that if I was making videos on those 2 consoles, I would probably use those. I could see myself picking those exact titles, but just swapping them between the consoles.
Sure.
I would say the GameCube shaped a generation. I would say the Nintendo 64 shaped a generation. I would say the GameCube was Nintendo's best mistake. But that's sort of related to like we said, the perspective that you have. And what's kind of interesting about that is when I really sort of step outside of my own experiences and try to set all that aside and try to just look at the entire history of like how these consoles were perceived, the truth of the matter is in each of their own times, the N64 and the GameCube had a whole lot in common.
Yeah.
They were both sort of seen as the N64 was seen as the beginning and the GameCube was seen as the continuation of Nintendo getting this very childish, puerile image and sort of having this image problem where like, oh, real gamers don't play that. Real gamers play on, they play real M-rated games for hardcore gamers. All Nintendo has is a bunch of baby stuff. They were both, the GameCube more so than the N64, I believe, was seen that way, but even at the time, I know that the N64 was sort of where that whole thing started, but then they each had this turnaround in public opinion as the kids who grew up with them came of age themselves and looked back on them and sort of changed the narrative about each of them.
Yeah, and like I said, you were clear about it, and I want to be clear about it. This discussion isn't meant to tear down one console or the fanatics of that console in favor of another. I'm not here to burn down the GameCube in honor of the N64's integrity, because that's nonsense. That is nonsense. I think we both love quite a bit on the GameCube, actually. And, as veterans, you and I, of the Nintendo-Sega console war, I don't think either of us want to engage in a Nintendo civil war. That's not really what interests me. Like, I find something to love about every Nintendo console, even the Virtual Boy. Josh, I love the Virtual Boy, and I don't care who knows it. I think
you're preaching to the choir on that one. You'll get no arguments from me.
And even Nintendo consoles that I'm still very harsh on, as I am the Wii U, I still acknowledge there are a lot of great games on the Wii U. You can play most of them on the Nintendo Switch, but the Wii
U. You can, but man, I love the Wii U. At the time, that was my most played console. I can't wait till those kids get here.
All 12 of them.
Yeah.
I think the Wii U, like, I look at the Wii U and I'm like, wow, that just was a fucking clusterfuck in every way. But I'm like, yeah, but it had some good games on it though, didn't it? And I can't hate any console that has Donkey Kong Country Tropical Freeze as its native habitat. So,
yeah.
I just want to be clear, like, if you are of the GameCube generation, if your fondest memories are of the GameCube, this episode isn't meant to tear that down for you. We're here to point out the perspective of the N64 generation and to maybe set some historical records straight. We're going to be talking about some sales numbers and some figures, and also just give
Sounds
you the
very exciting.
We're going to give you the lay of the land in the 1990s and how things actually felt, because I've been talking about secondhand knowledge, right? And so I think if you were too young or you weren't even alive yet during the N64's heyday, it's hard to really get a gauge on what the system meant to the wider culture unless you were there. Because it's one thing to just look at statistics or, like I said, secondhand information and form an opinion on there, but you're not really getting the full picture. And it's a complicated situation, the N64. And I don't know, we were talking about this back in September, but I feel like narratives have a way of setting in online discourse, and then they're very hard to shake. And I'm not expecting that we're going to change anybody's opinion here, but
yeah, the only thing that's going to change the discourse is just time.
Yeah.
That's what really does it.
Yeah, but it's just one of those things where, and I'm encountering this a little bit myself as far as the, cosmology of the DKU and Rare fandom as that evolves and younger generations pull in, because I'm now encountering, as I've said, Banjo-Kazooie fans who have never played Diddy Kong Racing, who were never exposed to Diddy Kong Racing, and they look at me like I am standing nude on the streets, with my my full-time job, screaming nonsense when I say that, oh yeah, no, Banjo is part of the same universe as Donkey Kong. He was actually introduced as Diddy's friend. And they think, what are you talking? Yeah, he was in Diddy Kong Racing. I know that much, but that's just a character crossover. That's nothing. And
I know what you mean, because it's like, at a time that seems long, that doesn't seem long enough ago to be considered anything like historical to us, we remember when that was very much the consensus.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. And then and then all of a sudden you've got younger generations coming up who have no recollection of that, have an entirely different frame of reference. And then all of a sudden you're having to defend your positions, when just the other day it was just accepted wisdom. Yeah. I mean,
there's a quote I often think of that goes something like, one thing that nobody warns you about turning 30 is that you're going to start hearing people younger than you talk confidently and passionately about historical events that you can personally remember very well and be completely wrong about them.
Yeah. That's spot on. I mean, that is chillingly accurate to how I feel some days. And I think you and I are a little bit odd, Josh, in that I'm not saying we were any different when we were younger, right? But I feel like
definitely not.
We've also always been intrigued by history and students therefore of history, where we've always wanted to know the full story behind something. And even before Wikipedia was a thing, I would love doing research on something and trying to get an idea of an existing property or whatever that existed long before I was born, trying to get a full understanding of it. And
like you said earlier about how it can be difficult to sort of glean what it was like about things that it's one thing to say play Super Mario 64, but you can't, if you didn't experience it at the time, then you have no way of ensconcing yourself in that context. You can't experience it in the context of the video game industry in 1996.
Yeah.
And I can relate to that very much, because that's exactly what the NES was to me. That was, the NES was entirely before my time. So going back and playing NES games, I was all like, just playing them on my own, I would kind of be like, well, okay, this is definitely, they seemed much, 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 much older than they really were because of how quickly the gaming industry, like, evolved back then. But it really took getting online and, like, seeing, sort of trying to see them through the lens of the people who did grow up with them, for me to, like, get a better appreciation of them.
And I think that's also why I really like laying out the full context of the time period whenever I do a spotlight episode series on a video game here on the Kongversation. Because, yeah, I spend that entire first installment telling you exactly what the situation was in that given year. And I feel like I feel like you can't separate that from the context of the game itself. And it's almost essential, critical to understand why a game is the way it is and why it hit the way it hit. And
we are very similar in that regard, because I do that with my videos as well. Like, I spend the first 10, 15, sometimes more than that. Like, the first part of the video is always, let's establish the historical context. Here's where I was. Here's where the industry was. And I get these geeky comments sometimes like, the review starts at 15 minutes and 26. No, it doesn't. That's important. That's also the hardest part of the entire video to edit, but, like, it's the most rewarding.
If I could be honest with you, Josh, that's why I became a fan of yours. Back before
that makes a lot of sense, yeah.
Back before we became friends, and I just, I watched your first video, I was like, oh my god, this guy gets it. And so it just, I mean, we're very similar, and that's why we've always been on the same wavelength, is we're just coded the exact same way when it comes to this kind of stuff. So that's why I feel like we can kind of give an even-keeled reading of, even if it's our own history, I feel like we are the ones who can do it justice because we have a respect for how things exactly went down. And so that's what we're doing here. And this isn't really, like I said, going to change any minds. It's just going to be smug validation for those who feel the way we do. But
well, I said earlier that, like, some people seem to think, oh, like, the 90s kids, they're not even around anymore. And talking to other people my age or people a little older, like, I think what it really is, more often than not, it's not that you're not still around or that you don't see it. It's just that you can't change anybody's mind. And that it's pointless to, like, not that it's pointless to try, but, like, I guess you just feel like you're past the point of seeing a lot of value in arguing with people about things on the internet.
Yeah,
so
I genuinely don't argue with people that much. Even from my little stoop of DK Vine, I don't use it as an argumentative tool to bludgeon people with. If people try to start something with me, I just usually ignore them. Or maybe I'll gently push back, but if people, like, about once a week now, I will get a comment or something on social media, and they said, hey, Greg Mail said he didn't intend for Banjo-Kazooie to be the same universe as Donkey Kong, so they're not in the same shared universe. You're wrong. Delete your site. And
yeah, exactly.
And I'm just like, you're just trying to get a rise out of me, and I'm gonna ignore you because life's too short.
Pretty much, yeah. It's not that we're not still around. It's more like just that I don't really see the point in taking flame bait anymore or engaging in flame wars, because it's not a good use of my time or energy.
No, I'd rather do something positive. I would rather contribute joy to this universe. And if I can do that with DK Vine, it's a silly kind of joy, but I still feel like I'm doing it nonetheless. And yeah, if people don't want to join in my reindeer games, holiday reference, see, I can be festive, then, fine, that's fine. This isn't going to be for everyone. But if anybody who does, want to come along on this journey with us, hey, welcome.
So I guess we should then go ahead and get into contextualizing the Nintendo 64 as it was in the mid-90s.
Yeah, and this is, I feel like I even get these into these arguments with my friends lately, like, because there is this just kind of set in stone narrative now, and it's true. It is a true narrative, but it misses the nuance of the time, where the PlayStation was the most successful console of the mid to late 1990s. And
Yes.
Because of that, the N64 was a failure at worst and a fledgling non-entity at best. And I don't think any take there is right or accurate. Yes, the PlayStation was obviously the most successful console, but that comes with shades of gray, man. It's not so black and white.
Yeah, like, the PlayStation... I guess can I just walk you through, like, my personal context of experiencing the N64?
Yeah, and then I will take you through my personal experience of the PlayStation.
Oh, this is going to be great then. I'm looking for this is exactly the kind of content that we like each other's content for.
There we go.
It's perfect. All right, so here's what's kind of funny, and I kind of had this revelation a while back thinking about this, is that the N64, more than any other console, and I mean, I was a frankly spoiled, rotten gamer kid. I was, I was my grandmother's only grandchild, and so I just got pretty much, like, not literally everything I wanted, but, like, pretty much. But despite, like, you know, I had a Genesis, I had a Super Nintendo, I had an N64, I eventually had a PlayStation, I had a Saturn, but more than anything else, the N64 was the console of my childhood. It was the console that I played more than any other, that I had more games for than any other, and the one that, like, really defined that I am rooted in more than any other. And that's really strange to me. It was kind of funny to realize that about myself, because I have this thing where, like, I think it might be the Sega fan in me, but, like, I always seem to want to make myself part of the out group or the underdogs. Like, I always want to feel like I'm fighting an uphill battle.
I can understand that for sure.
Yeah. Because, like, when, like, about 6 or 7 years ago, when N64 nostalgia was at its peak, I was always like, oh, these kids in there talking up Donkey Kong 64, probably never even played the Super NES games. Like, even at that time, I saw myself as being older than the thing that was the most nostalgic thing in the world.
Yeah.
But I look back on that time now, and I'm like, a lot of those people were probably my age.
Yeah.
Like, you know, quite frankly, the truth of it is, we're probably past the crest of peak early 2000s nostalgia now. A lot of the GameCube kids are in their 30s at this point.
Oh, God.
So, yeah. Think about that. So, yeah, it was just kind of funny to think, but I think what really made the difference for me there, and what part of that influence was that, like, even back then, even like even as early as like 12 or 13 years old, I was always way more into, like, quote unquote old tech than my peers. A lot of people in, like, a lot of my peer group, like the PlayStation or the Nintendo 64, but never the Saturn. One of those was their first video game console. Like, that was the first one they'd ever played. I got my Genesis at the very end of kindergarten. And like, that was also about the time that I started reading gaming magazines. And most of what I read in them went all the way over my head. But the big thing that I really remember, even as early as 94, and it was going on well before this even, was that everyone knew and everybody couldn't stop talking and nobody could, like, what was being looked forward to was the next generation. They were always talking about the next generation of consoles. They were always talking about Project Reality or Sega's next console. And, like, a lot of what was on the market right then, it was like, okay, well, this is kind of passe. Like, oh boy, yet another 2D platformer, but it's the next generation that's really going to change things. And then you had the PlayStation and Saturn come out in 94 in Japan, in 95 in the Americas. And from that point forward, what you kind of started seeing was, at least, this is like, what I'm pulling from here is memories of reading magazines from back then and the very, very, very early internet, because my family was like a very early adopter of the internet. We had Prodigy before I even knew what the internet was. And once the PlayStation and Saturn were out, there came this like big, enormous hype cycle that like, yeah, the PlayStation's cool. The Saturn, Sega's already having some issues with that. But what you're really going to want to wait for is the N64 and Super Mario 64. And that was sort of the first time that I experienced what has become like a very common part of gaming discourse, the hype cycle.
Yeah.
Because for what seemed like, to me at the time, just an eternity, I was reading about Mario 64. I was seeing screenshots of Mario 64. The early internet had this sort of tongue-in-cheek group that called themselves the Mario Monks. And their life philosophy that they espoused was that you would be better off not buying a PlayStation or Saturn right now. Don't be too lustful. Don't waste your money. Don't waste your purity. You'll be happier and more well off if you save yourself for the Nintendo 64. And like that's like always something that it's so emblematic of like what the internet was like in 1996.
Mm-hmm.
Just this very tongue-in-cheek, like, group that made the rounds on Usenet and AOL.
It wasn't just a rage-filled, clickbaity death spiral.
Oh, I mean, we still definitely had flame wars back then. But
yeah.
But after all that, after, again, what seemed like an eternity to me, the system finally came out, and I somehow convinced my mother the day it came out, one, that I was sick, and I wasn't really very sick at all, and two, that we needed to go to Blockbuster and rent one, and I don't know why, but she let me do that.
Wow.
So I played Super Mario 64 on the day it was released, and I held that controller on the day it was released.
Yeah,
and I got to experience it in that context, and it was the first 3D game I'd ever played. I didn't know about Star Fox. I guess I'd played Wolfenstein 3D, but you know what? It was the first polygonal 3D game I'd ever played or ever seen, and it lived up to all that they said it would be and more, in my mind. It was, I could not imagine video games ever being better than that. And I got my own N64 that Christmas. Absolutely loved it. Like, played the absolute fuck out of it. The N64, like, throughout its entire life, kind of had this, it had a reputation online and in the magazines as being a system that got, like, 1 or 2 or 3 really great games per year and didn't have a lot to play besides that. But as a kid, that worked out just absolutely perfectly because I could only really get 1 or 2 or so games a year.
Yeah. So this is something that, as a Nintendo kid, up until I basically shifted my allegiance to Rare, but as a Nintendo kid, I didn't really process that complaint. And I look back now, and I see that was a common complaint, especially in magazines like GamePro, EGM, But if you're just reading Nintendo Power is not going to be like, wow, Nintendo's not really releasing much, are they? But it felt like the games we were getting hit harder. It was, I mean, and that was actually their mantra during that time is quality over quantity. And I don't know
if... Oh, yeah, you heard that all the time.
Yeah, and I don't know if that was just, something that they came up with to explain away their failures, but it sunk in as a kid, and I was like, well, yeah, the games we're getting mean a whole lot more. And it was an event whenever a big league Nintendo game came out on the N64. It was like something all your friends were going to be trying out. They're going to be renting it. We're going to be playing it together. If we like it enough, we're going to be buying it. I mean, that was it. I mean, and it wasn't a big deal. Like you said, when you're a kid and you don't have a whole lot of income, and I don't have a whole lot of income now that I'm an adult, but, you have a lot less spending power when you're, on a fixed allowance, or you have to negotiate with your parental units. So.
Right. Oh God, parental units. I haven't heard that. I haven't heard that since I was a teenager. Wow.
So I'm taking it back. I'm taking it back to our childhood, Josh. But yeah, I mean, it did work out perfectly well for the youth. If you were a Nintendo youth, then hey, there were really no complaints.
Yeah, there weren't. And again, I suspect that the experience that I remember having just purely within myself and among my peer group with the N64, and what you're talking about there, where, everybody was going to get the new game, everybody's going to be playing it, to like, from my perspective, it seemed like everyone I knew had an N64, and if I wasn't on the internet at that time, and boy, looking back, 8-year-olds probably shouldn't have been on the internet even in 96. But if I hadn't been on the internet and or reading, like, magazines outside of Nintendo Power, I can totally see why it would have seemed to me like, yeah, dude, everybody loves this thing. This is the console everybody has. And I think that is exactly how a lot of people who grew up with the GameCube remember it.
Yeah, so first of all, I would like to apologize to any 8-year-olds who discovered DK Vine back in the day. I would do things differently now, had I known the awesome responsibility I apparently had. But
I was too young to be reading DK Vine at like 12. So.
I was just a dumb kid myself, basically, and I thought thought I was, I know better now. But hey, yeah, you're right. Like, so let me. I said I was going to explain my relationship to the PlayStation, but I think I have to backtrack a little bit and explain the N64 because I am a few years older than you, Josh.
And I thought that would be interesting too, because like I have written in my notes here, like Hyle may be more familiar than me, because that's the thing. Like, let me just to finish my story.
Yeah.
What kind of happened was, like, before the N64 came out, I remember everyone was it seemed like everybody was just heralding it as what was going to be this revolution. This was going to be like the last console that we would ever need because it was going to be that good and that powerful and that amazing. So it came out, and that's exactly how it hit me. And then I remember this so specifically that I picked up a magazine in February of 1997, and the opening blurb was talking about, like, how the N64 was struggling next to the PlayStation. And I was like, the PlayStation? What?
Yeah.
Like, I'd heard of it, but I was like, really? That's not Sega or Nintendo. How are they doing any good?
So, obviously, I am of a similar perspective. I was a Nintendo kid. When I was maybe 4 years old, we got a Nintendo Entertainment System, and by this point, the NES had been out for several years. I mean, this is before the SNES, but it was relatively late in the life of the NES, which was a long life for a console, but
especially at that time.
We got an NES, and but I was like 4 years old, so this is the first like true experience with a Nintendo system that I had, and I got a Super Nintendo for one of my birthdays. I I could probably figure it out right now, but I'm not going to do the math. But I got a Super Nintendo maybe a year or two after it had been released in the West, and so for the longest time, like the Super Nintendo was like the center of my universe, and I played it religiously, and then Donkey Kong Country came out in 1994, and everything changed for me because, as I've often explained, either on this podcast or elsewhere in the DK Vine ecosystem, Donkey Kong Country came out and just completely obliterated my interest in anything else, because Donkey Kong Country just so happened to perfectly align with everything I've ever wanted in a video game. It was just perfectly tailored for my sensibilities, and I was done. Like, nothing else could compare, and all I cared about was the next Donkey Kong game, the next entry in the series, what would come from it, what would spin off from it. I stopped caring about Mario. It was basically true love, right? Like, I had fallen head over heels, and everything else was just cold and a few shades paler now compared to Donkey Kong Country. So when Donkey Kong Country came out, it was also paired a lot with the hype for Nintendo's next console, then known in the West as the Nintendo Ultra 64. And so you couldn't escape the discussion between two, because if Nintendo could do what they're doing with Donkey Kong Country on the Super Nintendo, well, the Nintendo Ultra 64 would be like nothing we've ever seen before. And
that was kind of the pitch. Like, and we didn't really, at least I certainly didn't really understand how pre-rendered graphics worked. So, like, you just bought it.
Yeah. I mean, a lot of people, like, when they first saw footage of Donkey Kong Country, they thought it was going to be for the N64. They were stupefied that it was for the Super Nintendo, and that Nintendo wasn't announcing their next-gen console yet. So, anyway, like, obviously, all I cared about was what was next for Donkey Kong. And so if the next Donkey Kong game was going to be for the Game Boy, well, then I was going to be all about that. And then, oh my God, they're making Donkey Kong Country 2? And that's all I cared about. But I was interested in the N64, the NU64 as we knew it then, because I wanted to know what Donkey Kong would look like on the NU64. I wanted to know what Rare could do on that new piece of hardware. So it was more like, I'm not as invested in the next-gen hardware, because with next-gen hardware also came the struggle of convincing your parents you needed it. And that was a whole other battle to be waged that was a lot more severe than just getting a new game, which, coincidentally always timed with my birthday. A new Donkey Kong Country is coming out in late November? Oh, lucky me. I was born in late November.
What are the odds?
Yeah. So, like, the NU64, I was like, yeah, that will be cool when we get to it, but I want a whole trilogy on the Super Nintendo. And, again, lucky me, I got my trilogy. But the Nintendo Ultra 64 was obviously, like, always in the back of my brain, and I was always daydreaming about what games would look like on it and what Donkey Kong would look like on it. And, I basically hyped a version of Donkey Kong 64 that would never actually exist on the Nintendo 64. There'd be no way it could be done. I was pretty much envisioning the current gen when I was daydreaming about what Donkey Kong could look like on the N64. Because, the N64 was built up to be this miracle machine. As you said, it would be the last console any of us would ever need. Because, oh my God, they're going to have the 64 disk drive, and they're going to have the expansion pack. Oh, this thing is going to go well into the future.
And, like, that's part of the reason for that, too, wasn't just that we were, like, drinking the Kool-Aid. It was also because, like I said earlier, the rate at which video like graphical fidelity and like gameplay design, the rate at which those things were evolving made it seem totally plausible that that like you could actually get there. Like, if you think about it, like, from the release of the Super Nintendo to the release of Donkey Kong Country was only 3 years. So in 3 years, you went from, a game that looked like Super Mario World, not dunking on Super Mario World. Super Mario World holds up well and it looks great. But you went from that to Donkey Kong Country.
Yeah.
In the space of 3 years. So, like, used to, you would look at, like, the first generation of a console's games as sort of like this tantalizing preview of, like, how do I put this? Okay, well, this is the conversation. I'll say it like this. When Banjo-Kazooie came out, I distinctly remember, and this was less than 2 years later. Mario 64, like I said, it hit me the way it did. I thought it was the best thing I'd ever seen. When Banjo-Kazooie came out, I remember the summer that I was playing that for the first time, I vividly remember just deciding just to see, I put my Mario 64 cartridge back in the console and, like, ran around the castle grounds. And in that moment, it didn't seem like it held up at all.
I mean, yeah, glorified tech demo, Super Mario 64. Yeah, I mean, to be fair, Banjo-Kazooie looks amazing compared to just what had come out on the console a year and a half prior. I mean,
exactly, and that's within a couple of years, like, the standards for video game graphics and design would just, like, even within the same console generation, would just get turned over, like, seemingly like 7 or 8 times.
Yeah. Yeah. And so it felt like the sky was the limit. Like, nowadays, we're just used to sort of this stagnant status quo where there hasn't been a radical leap forward with how games look. For a while now, like I don't think we're ever going to make such a leap again as we did during this time period. And
at least not as long as games continue taking the form that we know them as right now.
Yeah. Right. I'm sure, once we have our neurolinks implanted into our brains, on the backs of all the hundreds of monkey corpses, then, we'll just have video games directly inputted into our cerebral cortexes, and then we'll
yes.
we'll have games that look like we've never imagined or never could imagine before we became part of the video game itself. But
that factor is something that I feel like is kind of lost among some younger gamers that I noticed, because, like, I saw a video a while back where they were comparing the graphics of a PS2 game that was released in 2001 to the graphics of a PS2 game released in 2007, and being like, why couldn't they make it look like this? And it's because, it was a 6-year difference, and that meant a lot in those days.
Yeah, for sure. But it was exciting, because it really did feel like we were on the cusp of the future, and it felt like video games were only going to keep getting better. And of course, in our child brains, we didn't think about things like dev time or the amount of hours that would go into video games if they kept looking better and kept looking more realistic and kept becoming bigger and bigger, how that would break the back of the industry.
To be fair, publishers often didn't think about that sort of thing.
No,
that was part of the problem.
Yeah. But when you're a dumb kid and summer lasts forever and the grass is always green and the air tastes oh so sweet, then it's going to be thrilling. And so I mean, as a Nintendo kid, because I was a Nintendo kid, I remember feeling like I was personally insulted when Sega ran those Genesis commercials attacking the Super Nintendo. I was like, dare they go after me like that? I like, ouch. But I was a Nintendo kid, stuck with Nintendo until I discovered my one true love in the Donkey Kong universe, and then it was time for the N64. And at the same time, I remember going into an electronics store. I honestly don't know if it was like I don't even remember what store it was. They no longer exist, but they had a robust section for video games, right? And it wasn't Circuit City. I remember Circuit City. I remember my Circuit City, but this was some other, maybe it was like a local electronics store that no longer existed. But I went into it, and I remember it was right around the time it launched. I remember seeing the PlayStation. I remember seeing a demo of the PlayStation. And so when you're a kid in the 1990s, generally, you're a typical kid, and, you know, my case, living in the United States, and there was Nintendo, and there was Sega.
Right.
All right. There were other video game consoles and companies, but they weren't really real, if you know what I mean. Like, yeah, I knew of Atari because my family also owned an old wood-paneled Atari we got at a yard sale at some point. And I knew of the history of Atari, and I knew that somehow Atari was still around making things. But Atari, I was like, they're kind of irrelevant. They ceased to be. It's Nintendo and Sega. They are the true constants of the video game industry. And
at that very moment, I'm sure there were people on Usenet, a decade older than you, who were going, man, just hasn't been the same since Nintendo showed up and ruined everything.
For sure. Yeah. Like, I absolutely.
I'm not joking there. There definitely were.
Yeah. So, you know, from my perspective, I see this PlayStation, and I'm thinking this is just going to be like the 3DO. This is going to be like the Jaguar. It's going to be like whatever, you know, like all of these consoles that I would see advertisements for in the peripheral, and none of my friends would actually ever own. Right? My friends only own Nintendo or Sega systems. Anybody I knew, and therefore my reality was set. Like, the world outside didn't make sense. I assumed that the people who own these other video game systems were like eccentric millionaires who just acquired them to have them and to play them.
Well, if you owned a Neo Geo, you pretty much had to be.
Yes. But the PlayStation was just like, I was like, oh, it's just another one of these, right? So I didn't think much of it.
Yeah, the failure of all of these companies that had come in and tried to compete in that space and just had flamed out immediately, primed us to sort of, I guess, not take the PlayStation seriously.
Yeah, exactly.
And I mean that was, and I mean like us specifically. I mean us as gamers, because a lot of the press did take it very seriously because they had a better handle on what kind of a pedigree Sony had.
Right, and obviously, at the time, I didn't know any of the history of how the PlayStation came to be and how it essentially spawned out of a failed partnership with Nintendo, how Nintendo were effectively the architects of their own market share, the demise of their own market share, where, you know, it had things not soured, that then history would have been drastically different. But it was probably around 1997 that, you know, I was desperate for news on the Donkey Kong game for the N64. And keep in mind, this is before Banjo-Kazooie was announced, before Conker was announced, before Diddy Kong Racing was known. And so all I really had for the N64, as far as Donkey Kong goes, was his appearance in Mario Kart 64. So I was thirsty. And Nintendo Power wasn't saying anything, and I didn't expect them to, because even though I was a subscriber to Nintendo Power, I read it religiously, I knew that I wouldn't get anything but corporate propaganda from Nintendo Power. I was like, I need to go outside of Nintendo Power to get the true details on the Donkey Kong game that I know Rare is making. I know they're making it. And this is also in the time where I was between AOL subscriptions. So 1997, I was offline. My family tried a trial in 96, and this was when they charged per minute or whatever.
Per hour, I believe.
Per hour, okay. And my dad was like, it's not worth it? No way. And so
This internet fad doesn't have a chance.
Right. So I was cut off and then didn't get back on until 1998. A lot changed in that year where my dad was like, oh, I guess maybe you should have it, you know, for school and such. And I was like, sure, for school. Yeah. So, yeah, a year later, DK Vine is launched. But I started to get magazines like EGM, and I would thumb through them even before this in like stores, but I would start buying them. And you would occasionally get in their rumor mills. Yeah, Rare is working on Donkey Kong or this or that or the other. And so it'd be like, aha. And I would take it to all my friends and be like, see, it's true. So anyway, I started noticing that the coverage of the PlayStation seemed to be disproportionate to what I assumed the PlayStation was. And the way they were talking about the PlayStation didn't really add up to my experience in my peer group, where we didn't know anybody who had a PlayStation. It wasn't a thing. And granted, like, I was in early middle school, right? I was like on the cusp of being a teenager, but not quite there yet. And so I probably wasn't in the exact demographic that hit so hard for the PlayStation when it launched. Because it did sort of take off with the older crowd first, right?
Oh, absolutely. Yeah, I think that's like the whole story of how the PlayStation came to be and how it thrived is just a fascinating story unto itself. But I think one thing it did really well, and one reason that it got so much positive press, is because it really was this, like, I don't want to use the phrase dream machine, but it was such a good console for, like, older gamers. Games, it was very easy to develop for. Games, it was very easy to publish games on, for that matter, thanks to the CD format and thanks to Sony's, like, the way that they would license it. So it, like, in comparison, like, you know, earlier we talked about the N64, every 6 months or so would just have this legendary genre, sometimes industry redefining game come out. But the PlayStation would get, like, 2 or 3 really good games a month.
Yeah. And so, like, the PlayStation, even if it had, like, cracked that shell of my peer group, I think the only game that would have ever really drawn my eye at the time would have been Crash Bandicoot. Right. Just because of the age I was at, because of what I was interested in. And that being said, I totally get why the Gen X crowd, why older high school students, college age students, why those who had grown up on the NES and played the SNES and the Genesis at a later age than I did, why they would then graduate to the PlayStation and bypass the N64 and the Saturn completely. You know, I get it, and I'm not dismissing that narrative, but I think when we look at the way the history shook out, we are creating this binary narrative of, oh, PlayStation success, N64 failure. And I think the point we're trying to get at is there was a whole lot more nuance, especially depending on your age at the time.
And not just your age, but also just where you lived even.
Yeah. Yeah, well, that's important. That's important, difference.
Yeah. Because do we want to get into the stats at all?
Well, I feel like we have to, and normally I don't like to bring math into the conversation because, you know, we're a fanciful show and we talk about lore and story and character development, and we rarely talk about things like numbers that go into video games. But I think this is important because it really does sort of crystallize where the N64 was a failure, where it was not a failure, and why it can't be dismissed as a complete failure.
Yeah, right? Because there was a region where the N64 pretty much was it was absolutely a bomb, especially relative to Nintendo's previous console, and that was Japan. In Japan, the Super Famicom, what they call the Super Nintendo over there, sold over 17 million units, but the N64 dropped so far from that and only sold 5.5 million. 5.5 million. So yeah, I mean, if we were just looking at Nintendo's native country,
then absolutely the N64 train wreck. Absolute flaming Tesla. But
and part of that was a lot of the games that really caught on over here, in particular Rare's games, but also GoldenEye, GoldenEye 007, the games that, the DKU games, I almost said GoldenEye wasn't a Rare game, but you know what I mean.
Actually, Josh, Rare
Of course
also developed
GoldenEye
007. Now, all the good ones then left Rare to form Free Radical, so,
nonetheless, the importance of GoldenEye, particularly in Western territories, cannot be overstated. GoldenEye outsold Ocarina of Time, okay?
Yeah, I don't know if people understand that today. Look, everybody had GoldenEye. I had GoldenEye. I mean, GoldenEye was inescapable, and I think GoldenEye actually kept the N64 in contention among older crowds. Like,
it absolutely did, yeah.
Yeah, even those who might have a PlayStation, they got an N64 just for GoldenEye because there was nothing like it on the PlayStation at the time.
Yeah, like, people... It's kind of funny, talking about the way that the discourse... we were talking earlier about the way that the discourse evolved over time. I remember, I think it was around 2011, there were all these articles coming out about how the console that college-aged people were bringing with them from home, way more than any other, was the N64. And I was in college at that time, and that was certainly my experience. Like, the school, I worked for the school newspaper, and we had an N64 set up in the office that we would play Smash 64 on. Mm-hmm. So, but it's kind of funny because people 10 plus years older than me, I've also heard, who were in college, in the late 90s, I've heard them describe the exact same sort of thing, like, staying up all night in their dorms playing GoldenEye. Like, that was, for the older crowd, that was the game to have on the N64.
Yeah, and I think it's an open question, like, how successful the N64 had been without GoldenEye. GoldenEye was like a killer app for
Absolutely.
The console, and I think it was a combination of factors, but GoldenEye kept it in contention with an older crowd, while the first party Nintendo games like Ocarina of Time and Super Mario 64 certainly kept the N64 viable for its usual crowd, and then Rare's other games really helped booster it as well. But yeah, you mentioned, like, okay, so the N64, you said 5.54 million units in Japan.
In Japan,
yeah.
Which is like about 12 million less than the Super Famicom had sold there.
Yeah, so the
big drop off.
The Super Famicom sold 17.17 million units in Japan, which is only down a slight bit from the original Famicom, 19 million some units.
Yeah,
so,
like that's kind of remarkable. Like, despite all the increased competition in the 16-bit era, the Super Famicom still sold almost as well as the Famicom had in Japan.
And
it's the N64 where the bottom dropped out there.
And also, I think a large part of why it wasn't successful in Japan is because of the lack of third-party support for the system, and because of the lack of RPGs. I mean, that was a huge factor in why it didn't have the market share that it did.
And it's kind of funny too, because in terms of the Japanese market, Sega like kind of swapped positions with Nintendo between the 4th gen and the 5th gen. Because in the 4th gen, the Mega Drive was very much an also ran in Japan. It buckled under the competition from the Super Famicom and the PC Engine. The PC Engine, which was R TurboGrafx 16, that was seen as the Super Famicom's main competition in Japan. In the next generation, it was just the opposite. The PlayStation and the Saturn were the two big competing consoles, and the N64 was the also-ran. Mm-hmm. And meanwhile, here, the Genesis was far more successful than the TurboGrafx 16. It is to this day, I would say the Super Nintendo versus the Genesis, at least for people our age, is like the definitive classic console rivalry.
Yeah.
Whereas over here in the Western market, then the Saturn was just absolutely obliterated by the PlayStation and N64.
Yeah, it was so funny because I remember the Saturn coming out and thinking like, all right, here we go, round 2, you know?
Yeah, right?
Yeah, and then it just, nothing happened. And I was like, wait, is the Saturn, nobody's talking about the Saturn. What happened?
Yeah, I said earlier the N64 was my childhood console. It was the most prolific console of my childhood, but the Saturn probably would have been that if they'd gotten a Sonic game on it.
Yeah, I
would have almost definitely skipped Mario 64 and gone for Sonic if they had done that for Holiday 96.
So obviously I've never been a big Sonic guy, but I've always been peripherally fascinated by Sonic. And so I was just waiting to see what the Sonic game on the Saturn would look like. I was like, oh, I bet it'll look really cool.
Right?
Nothing. Knights was cool.
Knights is great.
Yeah.
Knights is great, but it was never gonna compete with Mario the way that Sonic had.
No.
I love Knights. Knights freaking rules, but it wasn't the same kind of game. It wasn't gonna be that kind of a killer app.
Oftentimes in these discussions, I feel like because Japan is Nintendo's home territory,
mm-hmm.
oftentimes the narratives get locked into what happened in Japan, and the rest of the world kind of gets brushed aside as if that also is an important part of the story. And I feel like with the N64, that's outrageous because this is where I think the idea that the N64 was a failure completely gets dismantled because, Josh, in North America,
mm-hmm.
the N64, now granted, North America is far larger than Japan, so things generally sell more here, right?
Yeah, it's not really fair to compare the numbers that something sells in North America to Japan, and that's not what we're doing here. You want to compare the same country to the same country.
Yeah, we're weighing an entire continent against a country, but
right.
So okay, in North America, the N64 sold 20 million units,
mm-hmm.
and again, that's 15 million units more than in Japan, but that's only 2 million units less than the Super Nintendo sold in North America. So
and similar story for Europe. It sold about 2 million units less in Europe.
Yeah, so that is not a steep drop off at all. When you factor in that the Super NES sold 11 million units less than the NES.
Mm-hmm.
In North America, the NES sold 33 million units. The SNES sold around almost 23 million. So,
right.
I mean, that sounds like a steep drop off there, but also the NES was around for a long time, and
it was pretty much the only successful
Yes.
console of its generation.
Yeah, so it didn't
at least in North America. In Europe, it was a different story.
Yeah, it didn't have a Sega Genesis equivalent to go to war with. So it was pretty much the uncontested ruler of the video game industry for the last half of the 80s and the early 90s. So, yeah, I mean, the N64 basically retained much of the Super Nintendo audience.
Exactly.
And
or at least it had a very similar audience. It was. And that's kind of like, if you look at the worldwide sales numbers, then yeah, Super Nintendo sold 49 million. N64 sold 32, almost 33 million. Yeah. But the vast majority of that drop off is because of how much worse it did in Japan. To us playing it in the West at the time, or at least in North America, the N64 was more or less just as prolific as the Super Nintendo had been the previous generation.
It really was. It was ubiquitous with gaming. I mean, and we can talk about our bubbles, right? Like,
yeah.
Bubbles usually within age ranges, because when I was in middle school, it was all about the N64. When I got into high school, people started getting PlayStation. Like that bubble was eventually burst. My peer group eventually got PlayStations, and then, you know, the Dreamcast, when the Dreamcast launched, I had friends who had a Dreamcast. But
I'm so jealous nobody else got a Dreamcast that I knew.
I played it a little bit once. But anyway, so yeah, as I got older, that sort of waned a little bit. But for the time period from launch up until like through 98, yeah, the N64 was it, man. It was just the console, and the PlayStation was this weird thing that kind of existed in a parallel universe that I eventually had to acknowledge. Yeah, I guess the PlayStation is doing all right. I guess it's a success, but
it's doing all right in that it's completely crushing everything that ever came before it. So.
Yeah. So when you compare the N64 to the PlayStation, it looks like the N64 was a failure. We're just saying the PlayStation was such a runaway success that it's kind of skewing everything to be a perception. Because you wouldn't say the Sega Genesis was a failure.
Right.
But, you know, even if the Super Nintendo outsold it in the end, I think the N64 did all right for itself. Where Nintendo made mistakes was, alienating their third parties, sort of salting the earth for their future as far as, fostering relationships with other studios. But at the time, you know, it like I said, it didn't really matter. And this is where Nintendo started to fall into this niche. And it wasn't really apparent then, but it became more apparent in the GameCube generation, where Nintendo was where you went to go to get Nintendo games. Right? And you had to go somewhere else to get everything else. And it started to shake out this way in this era, but it wasn't until the next generation, especially with the launch of the Xbox and the PS2, where, so if I want the other video games, I have to go there, and then I'll go to the GameCube to get Nintendo titles.
Right. And speaking of that, to show how much of a difference like that shift really made, and I'm not saying this to like dunk on the GameCube at all, because here's the thing I said earlier, I always want to feel like I'm part of the out group. The truth of it is, in as much as you grew up with the N64, I grew up with the GameCube. I was the same age for the GameCube that you were for the N64, and it was my primary console at that age.
The N64 to you is what the SNES is for me. You have
pretty much.
Yeah, you have fond memories of it, but your core associations aren't necessarily tied to it.
Well, they kind of are, though. I was kind of getting into that earlier, where I was saying that, like, even when I was like 12 or 13, I was very into old tech. Or what my friends saw as old tech, I'd be like, "Hey, look, it's the Sega Nomad," and they'd be like, "That's so old. Why are you still playing that?" But I think part of it was like the influence of the internet, because of course on the late 90s internet, everybody loved the NES. Everybody loved espouse the virtues of 2D and was very nostalgic for that. And I think that was very influential on me, and it caused me to go back and like bust out the Genesis and the Super Nintendo and be like, "Oh man, wait, I think I might like some of these games better than like the new stuff."
Mm. Yeah.
But anyway, what I was getting at, the N64 sold almost as many units in North America as the GameCube did in the entire world.
Yeah, so like
just in North America.
We're not here to dunk on the GameCube. I like I said, could never hate any system that housed Star Fox Adventures. But even though I didn't get Donkey Kong Racing, I still have a lot of fond memories of the GameCube. I love the GameCube, in fact. The GameCube just has this lovely feel to it. Whenever I boot it up and I get the little startup music and animation, it just makes me happy, right? But what people are starting to think of the N64 in terms of, the GameCube actually was that as far as sales go.
It kind of was.
You want to talk about how poorly the N64 did in Japan? Let's talk about how the GameCube did in Japan, Josh. Yeah. So the GameCube sold 4 million units in Japan, down 1.5 million from the N64s.
Yeah. That's a steep drop off percentage wise.
Now in North America, I mean, it was even a more of a severe drop off. Sold 12.55 million units, which is, down nearly 8 from the N64.
Yep.
Yeah. Europe also suffered a little bit of a drop, about 2 million units. And so, overall, the GameCube, up until that point, was Nintendo's worst faring console.
But here's the thing: if we're skewing the data a little bit here because the Wii, not a lot of people remember this anymore, but the Wii was actually 2 GameCubes duct taped together, and it sold over 100 million units. So that's actually an additional 200 million GameCubes that were sold.
You got me there.
Yep.
No. So it's like, again, it's not disparaging the GameCube. The GameCube is this lovely little piece of hardware. It's got so many classic games on it. You can never take that away from it.
We're more using this to sort of put the N64's presence in the North American and European market into the right context.
Right. And I wasn't a kid when the GameCube came out. I was a legal adult when the GameCube launched, or at least close to it. So I can never know what it was like growing up GameCube, right? So if somebody comes at me with their experiences, I'm not going to discount them, just like we're coming to you with our experiences with the N64. And so for all I know, maybe the GameCube was... You had similar Nintendo bubbles on the playground, right?
I mean, I'm absolutely positive that it did, yeah.
Yeah. So this is just a generational thing, but it's just I'm tired of it, Josh. I we're all fans. We're just slightly older or younger than each other. Let's learn from each other and share wisdom.
Yeah, and that's what kicked all this off is that sometimes I'll, in my videos sometimes I'm describing the market as it was in 96 or not in 95 or 96, and I'll say something like, the N64, this powerhouse of a console, was just over the horizon, and people are like, the N64 wasn't a powerhouse. The PlayStation was no, the PlayStation was technologically inferior to the N64. But the N64 was the most powerful console on the market when it was released.
It was.
And it wasn't until the Dreamcast came out.
The PlayStation was far easier to develop for.
Yeah, that makes a difference. Raw power is not everything.
No, it really isn't. And I think Nintendo, learned that lesson because they would never have the most powerful console on the market ever again.
Nope. That was the last time.
Yeah, I guess that was their takeaway from it. It's oh, okay, so, yeah, and I think that's, the shift then, too, is, where we were talking about the N64, and it felt like anything was possible, the future was unyielding. It was just gonna go into the horizon. And with the GameCube, it felt like Nintendo shrank. I mean, literally, the console shrank. It was a little tiny thing with a handle. It was a lunch pail, but... It was also the point where Nintendo started becoming more like the toy. And that's not fair. That's not a true, accurate reading, but that's the feeling compared to the PS2, compared to the Xbox. The GameCube. Well,
I don't think it's even that unfair, because I think that was always sort of how Nintendo approached game design, and that's a lot of what I like about them and appreciate them about them, their approach to it to this day, is that they do see it as Nintendo was a toy company before they got into video games, and they've always kind of had that spirit of it.
But I think the GameCube was just poor. There were a couple of poor decisions that led the way it was marketed and the way it was presented to be off-putting to people at that time.
That's for sure. It definitely was off-putting to people.
I think
it wasn't what the market wanted in 2001.
No, it wasn't. And had they just made a couple different changes, like having a DVD player in it, having regular sized disc, I think the GameCube could have honestly been more of a contender. But
and it's kind of funny because it's very similar to what happened to Sega in that same generation, albeit, Nintendo's hardware business, of course, survived and even thrived again. But Sega with the Dreamcast put out this console whose selling point was, this is the games console. This is the one that's going to bring the arcade experience home. This is and this is the one that's going to like push the industry into new experiences of gameplay with online play. And that alone wasn't enough anymore.
No.
And then you had the same thing with Nintendo doing their usual, games as toys approach, and the market rejected that in much the same way.
No, why would you have that when you could have a whole like home media machine that does everything for you? Like, honestly, like, I'm an Xbox gamer as far as like that is my home console. Like, obviously I have a Switch and I play a lot on my Switch, but the Xbox is where I do most of my business, and the main reason because of that is because I do all of my streaming from there. Like, I stream all of my my shows and movies from my Xbox. Right. I can't imagine not having that function. Right? So
yeah.
Yeah, it just like little mistakes were made, and yeah, you can market it as no, this is just for games. We're just gonna focus on games. We're not gonna have.
But when you say Nintendo shrank, what I really think of is like every generation, like from the NES to the N64, would toward the beginning of it, there would be the Nintendo's consoles back then, at least in Western markets, launched alongside this Mario game that would set the standard for the generation. Like games that would come out after that point, after Super Mario Brothers, after Super Mario World, and after Super Mario 64, would iterate on a lot of its concepts and evolve them. Mm-hmm. Even games in completely different genres. The GameCube was the first time where Nintendo wasn't setting the standard that way. You can think about whatever you like about Mario Sunshine, but it wasn't a game that caused like game design philosophies to trend in its direction.
Yeah, the GameCube is, and we viewed it derisively at the time period because it was a very angsty time for DK Vine. What with the buyout,
was it ever?
Oh yeah, with the buyout and Rare all of a sudden being an Xbox developer and the future of Donkey Kong in question and the portrayal of Donkey Kong in question, and we didn't deal with it in the best way probably, but it was just unknown uncertainty colliding with the growing pains of getting older and having that generational shift happen in the most violent way possible for our fandom. Just like, everything's changing overnight. Bam, bam, bam. And so we were viewing a lot of what Nintendo was doing as also a betrayal of like, wait a second, they're just making gimmicky games now. Like they're adding quirks to them. They're adding innovation. The quote unquote innovation. Like, why does every game have to have this little twist? Why can't they just make a really good sequel? Why does everything have to be like attached to something else? Why does Mario have to have a backpack? Why does Donkey Kong have to be controlled by bongos? Why is Zelda cell shaded?
Oh no! Oh, the humanity! And like, people joke about that, but like, that really was how the internet felt about it at the time.
Yeah.
Like, I remember this poll, I found it on the Internet Archive once, on a fairly big Nintendo fan site at the time. The poll question was, do you see the graphics in the new Zelda as being a problem or a detriment? And like 93% or something said yes, that they hated it.
Yeah, it was a huge controversy.
Like, it wasn't just a niche that was saying this,
Yeah. I think like one of the only games that was unquestionably loved at the time is Super Smash Bros. Melee, which was just a really good sequel. It was the N64 game, but better. And so, yeah,
and when I got the GameCube, that's what I wanted. Like, yeah. That's what I expected. I expected the GameCube to be to the N64 what the SNES had been to the NES. And I love the GameCube, but it wasn't that.
Yeah. And to Nintendo's credit then, like, they didn't, like, take the failure of the GameCube and just say, okay, well, I guess we need to make a true competitor to the PlayStation. They went even harder in their own direction and said, no, we're going to make this even more of a toy. And, and with the Wii, that was unquestionably a success in a way that, I think even surprised Nintendo.
Yeah, it worked out better than probably even their most rosiest projections could have thought it would.
I've often talked about how shocking it was when my parents and my grandparents had a Wii before I did.
Oh, yeah. Jeez.
Yeah. And then maybe they learned the wrong lessons from the Wii, and they just thought, oh, the Wii is the brand now. Wii U. No.
The Wii U is one of those things where it's like, you can't fault them for going in that direction. You just, with the benefit of hindsight, you can totally see it, but like, as big of a success as the Wii had been, why would you not try to follow up on that?
Yeah, but I feel like with the Wii, they enlarged their audience. They roped in a lot of people who wouldn't ordinarily have a video game system. It was a lot like the NES was when it launched. Mm-hmm. The problem was they didn't retain that audience. Like, they had Wii Bowling. Well, they had Wii Sports. Why would they need to get a new Wii?
And I guess in retrospect, the GameCube and the N64 can both be seen, retroactively of course, as this sort of transitional period of Nintendo sort of accepting that they, like, learning and then accepting that they're not going to be the standard bearer of everything that gaming is anymore. Mm-hmm. And then coming up with a completely new direction. And I think, in hindsight, the GameCube in particular kind of feels like this in-between step between it was just as capable as it wasn't the weakest console on the market. It was sort of half trying to target the same audience that Nintendo always had, but it ended up with this reputation.
Yeah. With the Switch, they hit that sweet spot where they've created something that really combines Nintendo's what's always been Nintendo's greatest strength, despite what's been happening with their console games, is the handheld market. So they finally found a way to take the strength of their handheld department and apply it to their console generation to make something that is sort of like a toy, but also gives you really great games, the same kind of Nintendo games you're always looking for on their console. And really give you something different from the PlayStation and Xboxes. So,
yeah, like the Switch has Nintendo's, it like has that mass market appeal of the Wii, while also being something that like your diehard gamer crowd is really gonna want.
Right. And something that you're not gonna get with the Xbox or the PlayStation. Like, so it's just funny to watch Nintendo's evolution since the N64. And, we're kind of getting off track here, but not really, because, like, why, this is in defense of the N64, why are we now talking about the Switch and the Wii U? But it really is, as you said, sort of like where the journey started with the GameCube. But, I mean, the N64, I think, is the last time Nintendo's ever been in the cultural conversation as far as, like, a big league console, like, viewed in the same light as its contemporaries. Like, yeah, the Switch is wildly successful. Yeah, the Switch is wildly successful. The Wii was wildly successful. But they've always been viewed as different than the PlayStation and the Xbox. Not really of the same, right? The N64 was the last time it was like, oh yeah, the N64 and the PlayStation, and so yeah, it's just kind of like the passing of an era where, yeah, the N64 is where sort of the bottom started to fall out, and what led to the GameCube, which then gave us the Wii, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. But I guess it's just a long way of saying that at the time, the N64 was treated seriously. It was considered a big deal, especially if you lived outside of Japan, where it performed almost as well as the Super Nintendo.
And honestly, I feel like the rare factor of that is kind of part, like, the central, like, one of the big things that we both share in our fascination on this whole idea of generational shifts and changes is the way that Rare is viewed in relation to Nintendo. Mm-hmm. Because you've told your story about, discovering Donkey Kong Country and that just being like like the game that changed your life. But to me, Rare, when I was a kid, I had never actually known a Nintendo that didn't have Rare.
Yeah.
Like, from my perspective, like, a lot of what I liked about Nintendo and thought of as being Nintendo was actually Rare. I did not see any any dividing line between them. Yeah. And I think part of the reason that that we see this a little bit as a little bit of a personal issue when people, deride the N64 or don't see, like, the value in it, or is because that the line between the N64 and the GameCube tends to be where that generational shift happens, because of aside from Star Fox Adventures, Rare had no presence whatsoever on the GameCube.
Yeah, and so when you say, like, the N64 was a failure, I'm like, excuse me, Diddy Kong Racing, Banjo-Kazooie, Banjo-Tooie, Conker's Bad Fur Day, GoldenEye 007, Perfect Dark. And
like, 4 of the top 10 best-selling N64 games were made by Rare. Like, in a lot of ways, they carried that console. Like, I'm not saying that it would have bombed in other territories the way it did in Japan without Rare, but I think it would have looked a whole lot more like that.
Yeah. I mean, I can't begin to tell you what Rare meant as a kid. Like, I remember, like, feeling like the N64 wasn't as great as the Super Nintendo back during that time. I made that argument as much online, but, like, I always said, set aside, like, but except for Rare's games, because that really was carrying the system for me. And, like, yeah, sure, I played Ocarina of Time. I played and loved Super Mario 64, if I'm honest. Yeah, my loyalties quickly shifted once we got Banjo-Kazooie, but, I played Super Mario 64 and I enjoyed the hell out of it, just like everyone else in 1996 and 1997. I even played Pokemon Snap and other games, but yeah, Rare really, they were the heart and soul of the system for me. And so, as a Rare fan, yeah, of course, the N64 is going to be one of the greatest consoles in my life. Because it's home to some of the greatest games, some of the games I've enjoyed more than any other games in my lifetime. So,
and I've talked about that before. A lot of the reason that the GameCube very well might have hit me the same way the N64 hit you, given the extremely similar ages and the similar context, if Rare had stuck with it. But the fact of the matter was, like I said, so much of what I thought of as Nintendo was actually Rare, that losing that was just an incredibly difficult shift. And, you talked earlier about the entire market, like, the entire video game industry just seeming to, like, flip over in the early 2000s and become something kind of, it wasn't what you thought it was before. And, I was dealing with that with both Sega, the failure of the Dreamcast and then going third party, and then Nintendo losing what I thought of as a big piece of their identity in Rare. So yeah, that was a very difficult time for me.
Yeah, growing up sucks, doesn't it?
Yep.
Yeah. Which is why we always cling to these golden years when we're like, I don't know, age 11 to 14 or so. I don't know. Like, it varies from person to person, depending on their own life experience. But generally, if you're privileged enough to have had a happy childhood and you're well off enough, your parents are well off enough, your family situation was well off enough monetarily to afford such luxuries as video games, then yeah, that's always going to be your true north for what video games are your entire life. Like, you can evolve with the times, you can discover new passions and loves, but you're always going to come back to that era in particular. And so I completely get it. I completely get why somebody who grew up during that era of the GameCube, post N64, would have this viewpoint and might look at the N64, especially when you look at the common wisdom of, the PlayStation steamrolled it, without, again, looking at the nuance and saying, well, yeah, but the N64 still did pretty well for itself. It was still a contender in a lot of ways culturally, even if at the end of the day, the PlayStation was the far and away the winner.
Yeah, it's not so much that the PlayStation crushed everything else in the market as much of it as it is that the PlayStation grew the market exponentially.
Yes.
Like the N64, like we've said, was pretty much like as successful as the Super Nintendo was. The PlayStation was just like nothing that anyone had ever seen before.
And I would argue that it was a trailblazer in the same way that the NES was a trailblazer in the 80s, where the PlayStation charted a path for people who, before then, video games were viewed as kid stuff. It was not something that you would carry on with as you aged, because there is no historical precedent for that, right? And so the PlayStation was the sort of the torch that gamers would carry as they entered the dark caverns of adulthood. And it would be like, oh, actually, I can still be a gamer and be in college and be in my 20s. And, the PlayStation is it. And it's a far more important console than the N64, absolutely. But it doesn't diminish what the N64 was or how much it hit with a certain age group, just like the GameCube hit with a certain age group. I mean, it's just a matter of perspective.
Yeah, I kind of, if you don't mind, I kind of want to read something from a magazine from back in the day that's always sort of stuck with me.
Sure.
If that's okay, it's your show.
No, go ahead and read somebody else's words from long ago.
This is from Next Generation magazine. They had a fold out that was sort of talking about it. Like, this was just after the N64 launch, and it's sort of speculating on what the console's chances are going to be. And I think this does a good job contextualizing where things were at the time. It says, without Super Mario 64, the Nintendo 64 would be nothing. With Super Mario 64, the Nintendo 64 is everything. It really is as simple as that. The range of N64 games revealed so far are shocking in their mediocrity. Sure, Pilot Wing 64 is exciting, Wave Race has potential, and there's no arguing with the pedigree roots of Doom, Cruisin' USA, and Super Mario Kart. At the time, Mario Kart 64 was called Super Mario Kart R. But it's Super Mario 64 that's causing all the excitement. The game's scope, depth, and sheer brilliance is simply breathtaking. Graphically, Super Mario 64 exceeds anything seen outside of an arcade, but it is the gameplay that will have diehard gamers salivating. Indeed, those who have not experienced the supreme playability and depth of Nintendo's in-house 8-bit and 16-bit games may appear slightly ambivalent toward Mario's 64-bit debut, but don't be fooled. This is as much a gamer's game as it is a sure mass-market blockbuster. But what of Nintendo 64's future? Can gamers look forward to a new golden age of genre-busting revolutionary 64-bit titles? Or is the Nintendo 64 doomed to be remembered as a one-trick pony? After all, how will other games even begin to match the quality of a project that took 2 years, 40 full-time staff members, and an unlimited budget, and the golden touch of Shigeru Miyamoto? And by the way, it's kind of funny, that they say a project that took 2 years and 40 full-time staff members, which was a lot at the time.
Yeah.
But that's a pretty dang small project now.
Oh, that's so charming. Oh.
Oh, I know, right? A wary eye is cast over Nintendo 64's chances of dominating Sega and Sony. Page 36 is where it all begins. I think magazines such as this probably had a very big influence on me in the way that they would talk about video games in such monumental fashion.
Oh yeah, for sure.
But that, you know, I was talking earlier about what it was like to play the N64 literally the day it came out. And the way it describes Mario 64 there, like, that is exactly how it hit me. It was like nothing that we had ever seen before. And that was the vibe I kept getting from the N64. That was, you know, it just kept showing me all of these genres and all of these games and all of these characters and all of these worlds that were just unparalleled with anything that would have been possible in the previous generation.
For me, it was like, wow, Super Mario 64 is incredible. I bet Donkey Kong's going to be 10 times what this is.
Oh, it's funny too, because like you said, you know, you were years away from having an online presence, and I was years away from being able to type well enough to have one, even if I'd wanted to. But I do definitely remember, like, I knew the pattern. I knew DKC came out in 94. DK Land came out in the summer of 95. DKC2 came out in the fall of 95. And it was just, I took it almost as a given that, like, well, the big N64 Donkey Kong game will definitely come out in the fall of 97, because that's just the pattern.
Right, no. And then the Virtual Boy Donkey Kong Land game will come out in 1998.
Yeah, the Virtual Boy will be a thing that exists in 1998.
You know, it made so much sense at the time. So we have a call, and we have a reader submitted textual call. So why don't I read that first? This is from Freezer. She sent this via social media. Yeah. Says,
I know Freezer.
Yes. She says, do you think the N64 would have a different public perception nowadays if it received a secondary official controller design later in life, like 1999, as an example? Both the Saturn and PlayStation did this, and the latter has basically stuck around ever since and defined late system titles. The controller is the main source of jokes from people who didn't grow up with it, the console, and in retrospect, a single stick wasn't the wisest thing, given how 3D games operated. Interested in what your opinions are of this weird hypothetical. The 3DS tried twice to incorporate a second nub, so the N64 could probably have failed as miserably as that. P.S. Talk about Mr. Pants. Well, we will get to Mr. Pants. I'm actually going to use Mr. Pants in an analogy in our final thoughts here. I promise I will. But Josh, what do you think about this?
Okay, the N64's controller. I think we're both qualified to talk about this in as we keep saying, in the context of its time.
Yeah.
So the thing about the N64 controller, and I'm holding the official Nintendo Switch Online N64 controller in my hands right now and looking at it. The thing that is really hard, I think, to parse about the N64 controller is that there was no standard at the time.
Mm-hmm.
There was no template to follow. For all I knew in 1996, this was how video game controllers were going to look. This was the shape they would take from then until time immemorial. There was no set standard for how or where, like, an analog stick should go. And I like, even at the time, you can find archive videos of people getting their N64s, or like, there's a channel that posts a lot of, like, camcorder footage from back in the day. And the guy gets out the N64 controller and he's like, well, that's kind of a weird thing. And I mean, I'm not saying it wasn't. It was this weird 3-pronged thing. But I think that's the sort of the main thing, is that there was no template to follow. So like you ask, in retrospect, a single stick wasn't the wisest thing given how 3D games operated. And, like, maybe you can say that with hindsight now, but if you look at the way that the DualShock was used on the PlayStation, it had 2 sticks and it was like nobody knew why.
Mm-hmm.
Like, there aren't a lot of, aside from very, very dedicated stuff like Ape Escape, there's not a lot of games on the original PlayStation that actually use the second stick for anything. It wasn't really until the next generation with Halo that you really started seeing a lot of games take advantage of it. And even like early on in the 6th gen with the GameCube, the Xbox and the PS2, a lot of like a lot of third-person action games back then were still putting camera controls on the L and R triggers. So like that took longer than the N64's lifespan for developers to even like know what to do with the second stick. So I do totally understand why they wouldn't have made a dual stick controller at that time, because the first time I saw the DualShock, I was like, why?
Yeah. It's almost impossible to actually describe what the N64 controller felt like at the time, because I think the standards for what a video game controller is have solidified so much since then. And, you know, there's just this basic uniform feeling to everything from the Switch Pro controller to the Xbox to the PlayStation. I mean, it's just, everything kind of has a similar feel to it. And the N64, it had to kind of chart its path. And at the time it was like, okay, well, of course we're going to have a weird looking controller. It has to look weird. We're going to be moving around in 3D. I mean,
exactly.
I didn't know what to expect. And so it was an adjustment, and nobody could agree how to hold it. I was holding it wrong apparently, but it felt right to me and it worked. I got the job done. So, you know,
go ahead.
No, it just like, it feels like a clunky piece of trash now, sure. Yeah, but at the time,
I still like it actually.
I mean, look,
but maybe that's my nostalgia talking. You were like about 13 for the N64, so you're gonna see it more similarly to how I do the GameCube.
When I got the N64 controller for the Switch, and I was playing Banjo-Kazooie with it, I was like, oh my god, how did I used to do this? This is so awkward. Eventually, though, the muscle memory did come back. So it was funny when I started playing my DK Vine Done Slow series for Banjo-Kazooie. I was like, I didn't know how to control it at first because I'm so used to playing with the Xbox controller now. But by the end of it, it was like second nature again. So,
whereas I got it and played Banjo-Kazooie all the way through with it, and I was like, oh, I missed this.
It just, but it was, like I said, there's nothing else like it. There were no standard sets. So I don't know if it would have made a difference, because I don't even think by the end of the N64's life, it was universally agreed how a 3D game should control or how it should feel or,
it wasn't at all. Like the Xbox, the original Xbox controller took quite a bit after the Saturn and N64 controllers, in that it had 6 face buttons.
Yeah.
So like the standards the standards like would take longer than that to be set. But I do want to say something, as long as we're talking about the controller, kind of in defense of the way that it was designed and what I think they might have been going for.
Sure.
Because one thing that you'll notice about a lot of Saturn and PlayStation games, if you go back to them now, is that, you know, I said earlier, not a lot of them know what to do with the second stick on the DualShock, but a lot of them don't know what to do with the first stick either. And part of that is, a big part of that is just because you couldn't take it as given that every PlayStation owner would have a DualShock, because it was introduced later. But I think it was also because the D-pad was so accessible on the PlayStation controller. Like, you could always just use that if you wanted to. There was no reason to force people to use the analog stick. I think part of the reason the N64 controller is designed the way it is was to make developers and make players acclimate themselves to the analog stick, because I remember trying to learn to play Mario 64 for the first time, trying to learn to control a character in 3D for the first time, and like basic actions that you wouldn't really think about were like, I was, falling off cliffs and going in the wrong direction and like just tumbling off of things. And I think if I had had the option to just use the D-pad, I probably would have done that.
Yeah.
But that would have been totally like going against like what the point of like what the game design was. So I think because the controller had this 3-prong approach where you could hold it, you could put your left hand on the analog part, or you could put it on the D-pad part, it forced players and developers to make a choice, and it forced developers to prioritize the analog stick as something that you would be using and like to work with 3D movement and get used to it. And of course that would never ever ever be a concern now. But I do think that's what they were going for. And I'll also say I love the Z trigger. Yeah,
yeah. I remember like there was that like steep learning curve of, oh my god, this is new. Oh my god, Mario's flopping all around. Oh my god,
exactly.
And eventually you got the hang of it, and it forced you to get the hang of it. And you might be right. Like that might have been the thinking. And
because like experienced gamers really, 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 really like they hate the feeling of like something different or new making them feel like they're not good at video games.
Right.
And they'll just stick with what they know if they can.
Yeah.
So yeah, I think that might have been part of what they were going for.
Yeah. All right. Should we take the call and then we'll wrap this up as best we can, because I don't think we can ever fully wrap this up. It's too nebulous and we have too much to say. But we
could talk about this all day. Yeah.
We could, yeah, and let's not. I got too much to do this time of year, so
sure.
Hey there, DK Vine. John Tessier calling in for another episode of the Kongversation. So this time we're talking about N64 and the nostalgia, or the perceived nostalgia around it. I grew up. My first console I ever remember was the N64. So I have a very fond memory of it. Growing up, talking to all my friends, we all basically agreed that the N64 was like the greatest console ever. But then, I grew up and I went on the internet and checked out and see that, not everyone shares that opinion. In fact, a lot of people don't think the N64 is a great console. And when I first heard that news, I was like, what? These people are crazy. They don't understand, they got to be there for it, and that's not the case. There's a lot of reasons people don't like the N64. And after playing some of the Super Nintendo games, like, Donkey Kong Country 2, like Live Alive, Chrono Trigger, all the amazing RPGs that were made at the time, it's easy to see why people didn't like the N64 era as much, because it's almost as if the Super Nintendo era was taking gaming and it brought it to another level. And there were so many things happening with fighting games, and all these different companies were making all these crazy games. And then N64 was almost like a back to basics to things, where we had to relearn how to design everything in 3D and all this stuff. So I understand why people don't like it, and but I will always have a soft spot for it in my heart, no matter what. All right, before I leave the time, have a good episode, and I can't wait to listen. Bye.
Well, thank you for the call, John. Yeah, I mean, it's. I guess back to basics would be a way to view the N64. It was basically like reframing how to make video games and the expectations of what video games needed to be, where the Super Nintendo was just an evolution of what came before the previous generation. It was just more of the same, bigger, bolder, where the N64 had to kind of reinvent the wheel, or the analog stick in this case.
Yeah, and that's why I say, like, I can very easily relate to how somebody born in 1998 must see, like, how it must be a little bit hard to glean what the N64 was like or why it was so important, because that's very much how I saw the NES.
Mm-hmm.
And the NES was, in that same sort of state of like, okay, we need to figure out how 2D video games are made and how this D-pad is going to be able to operate.
Yeah, and it's hard to get a grasp on the full history of something when you're jumping in midstream or wherever you are in the timeline, and it's hard to then go back and appreciate what came before. Like, I'm gonna bring it back to the Beatles, Josh. All right, so like, obviously the Beatles are before my era, but I really grew to love the Beatles. But then the Beatles, they loved the rock and roll of the 50s, and that's not really my thing. Like, I can respect, like, Chuck Berry and all the greats from that era, but it's just not the sound that really, like, works for me. I like the Beatles' original music, but, it's just a generational thing where what they grew up with the 50s rock, and that's what got them into it. And I like their music, and, and so on and so on. This is applicable for anything, any form of entertainment.
And sometimes you can end up having like vicarious nostalgia through the lens of somebody else's perspective.
Yes.
Or just because that's what they talk about, or that's the kind of work that they allude to in their own productions.
And that's why that's another thing that really attracted me to your videos is the vicarious enthusiasm you have for everything you cover. Like, I might not be a Sonic the Hedgehog fan on your level, but I can appreciate your enthusiasm and zest and zeal for the series because I find it very relatable for how I feel about Donkey Kong and Rare.
Mm-hmm.
So I think we just all have to understand each other. We just have to yeah, that's not how I feel about that particular thing, but I totally get where you're coming from. And
I can point to things that I do feel that way about, or that I remember feeling that way about.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. And like I said, I keep coming back to it, but we're always going to be the products of our childhood. And, especially if our friends also had that experience, our friends of that era, if we all played the same things, that is going to be the true defining truth of that era. And yeah, when I was in my teens and even my 20s, the endless nostalgia for the original NES, it rankled me. It irritated me because I felt like it was diminishing what I loved. I felt like they were saying this earlier era was far more important and beloved than the era I was a part of. I had an NES. I played the NES. I loved the NES, but it was never my system in the same way that the NES, but especially the N64, were my systems.
Right. And that sort of thing can also be kind of alienating. Like, I remember as a teen reading a review of the Mega Man Anniversary Collection, and the opening paragraph was something like, if you were too young to experience these games back in the day, you need to get off the internet. I'm like, well, I can't. I couldn't have done that.
Right.
I'm sorry.
Yeah.
I like Mega Man. Hello?
Yeah, there's this tendency to always want to talk down to the younger generations, and then there's a tendency for the younger generations to always want to burn down the older generations, and it's exhausting. As somebody
who's ever heard of the Ice Climbers? Nobody likes them. Why are they in Melee?
As somebody who's been on both sides of this divide now, oh my god, can we just...
Yeah, now it's like, who the fuck is Banjo? Nobody cares about him. But it's the same thing.
It is. And, I am somebody, I really started to discover who I was, and you never stop discovering who you are, by the way. I want to be clear about that. Like, never stop evolving, never stop learning new things about yourself. But, I really started crystallizing as a little individual during that play it loud era of Nintendo, where Nintendo of America was marketing things with 90s attitude, man. Like, yeah, fuck your parents. Play it loud.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah. And Rare came up as Nintendo's right hand. Like, they were essentially, it was Nintendo, and then they had Rare right behind them, backing them up. And Rare felt so prolific. It was basically like second Nintendo within Nintendo. Like, Rare always felt like they were larger than they actually were. They didn't feel like they were a studio. They didn't feel like they were just a studio. They felt like they were this whole entity that could go toe to toe with Nintendo if they wanted to. Like if Rare wanted to break away and say, like, we're taking the fight to you now, Nintendo, put them up. They could have done it because it felt like the ridiculous output they had during that era. It's still unreal. Still doesn't seem feasible.
Yeah, you think about the games that were released from 1994 until 2002 just by this one developer.
Yeah.
And it's completely ridiculous.
It would be ridiculous in any era. But I still don't know how they pulled it off. But, despite all of that, despite the way I felt, it was always the 8-bit generation that was glorified and hyped. And
I mean, the industry, we've talked about it in this episode, the industry grew around them. The industry for a long time grew by following their tastes.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. So, yeah, I mean, I understand the way now, like, the younger millennials and the Zoomers, and I understand. Like,
and the alphas?
Yeah, it's the alphas now, is it? Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah, right? That's what he said, right?
That's what he said, yeah. Man.
Yeah.
They are not going to think that one's funny.
The GameCube generation, the Wii generation, like, I get it. I get the frustration of how you feel. That desire to want to tear down what immediately came before in order to find that justification, that validation in our own personal narratives, because we are the hero of our own story, are we not? The journey that we're on must be the very ideal of the Joseph Campbell monomyth. Josh, it's, that includes whatever the hell console we played the most and whatever defined that era of our life. But I guess the ultimate crux, the ultimate point of this episode is we also can't ignore history or bend it to our own taste. Like, I loved It's Mr. Pants. I think It's Mr. Pants is the most brilliant puzzle game of all time, because it definitely mixes ingenious and addictive gameplay with, in my opinion, deeply rich characters and just absolute gonzo lore. But when someone comes at me,
you're welcome, Freezer.
Yeah, when someone comes at me with the hard statistics and says, "Hey, did you know that Tetris, this game called Tetris, out of the Soviet Union, it's a bit more successful in sheer numbers than It's Mr. Pants."
A little bit.
Yeah, I'll look at those numbers and I'll say, well, I guess I have to accept that. I guess I have to accept that Tetris is more successful than It's Mr. Pants, even if that narrative, that factual narrative, hurts me a little bit.
It causes you psychic damage. Yeah.
It wounds me just a bit, because in my own bubble, It's Mr. Pants is the master of the puzzle genre. How could it not be? It's Mr. Pants. It's in the name. But, I think accepting that.
But here's the thing, and I think you've always got to keep this in mind, because going on, say, Twitter and looking at the state of gaming discourse now, just doing that causes me psychic damage, because all you see is people who are going through the same thing that I remember going through and that I remember seeing other people go through. And it's like, you can say, yeah, of course you'll accept the narrative that Tetris is more successful than its Mr. Pants. And I know we're making an exaggerated joke about it, but would you have been able to so easily accept it when you were like 20 years old?
No.
Or would you have been really kind of unjustifiably pissed off about it?
And part of the reason I do what I do now, I do episodes like this with you, is to kind of help people, maybe, avoid the same mental, fisticuffs and just sheer anguish that I went through, that my contemporaries on DK Vine went through during that era. I mean, it sucks. It sucks. Yeah. Online discourse at that age sucks, especially when it feels like our own childhood are under attack. And, you know, here, on the flip side of everything that we were saying, as an N64 fanatic, as somebody who will defend the system to my dying breath, yeah, Nintendo made serious, grievous mistakes with the N64 that wounded the company for years. I can slag on the GameCube all I want, but that started with the N64.
100%.
Yeah. And the N64, I really do feel like was when Nintendo got so high on their own supply. And they thought like, well, we're Nintendo. What we say goes for the industry. And
yeah, I mean, and to be fair, that is how it had been for over a decade at that point.
Yeah, and then overnight they alienated third parties, and Sony, their aborted partner for this add-on to the Super NES, all of a sudden reaped the benefits of their mistakes and overnight became the industry leader. And I think took everyone
far
off guard.
Outstripping even what the NES was. I mean, the PlayStation blew the NES out of the water.
Yeah, and I don't think Nintendo expected it, and Nintendo fans didn't expect it. Nintendo fans of that certain age during that era didn't expect it. And
nope. I mean, we haven't even discussed like what a mistake it was seen as even at the time to stick with the cartridge format at that time. Like there was just it seemed completely insane to do it, and indeed that is a big part of what alienated so many third parties.
Right, and don't get me wrong, I love an N64 cartridge. Like the
me too.
The feeling of it in my hand, the weight. You know, when you would pick up an N64 cartridge and the question was, how heavy is this one going to be? Because they weren't the same weight, and you're like, oh, this one's heavy. This must be a really good one.
Banjo-Tooie is a very heavy game.
Oh, and I knew that was because of the secret mechanism to get the ice key in there. I just knew it.
Yeah, you'd reach this point of the game where you'd pull a switch and your cartridge would open up automatically. Yeah. Steam would come out the sides of it.
I didn't know how it would work, but it would be like a transformer, right? It would eventually just, I'd pop it open like, oh my god, I found it. But look, despite the mistakes of the N64, it was a time of immensely revolutionary games, of software, a time when they had the unique position of having a Western partner studio in Rare who practically doubled their output, and at least in the minds of the true believers, the ones who had an N64 and were all about the games that Nintendo was releasing, you know, it kept them on par with things like PlayStation, where, no, we weren't getting all the third-party games we got on the NES and the SNES, but it didn't matter because the weight of what we were getting, those heavy cartridges, just hit all the more because, yeah, we were getting games like GoldenEye, we were getting games like Banjo-Kazooie, Diddy Kong Racing, alongside Ocarina of Time and Super Mario 64 and Mario Kart 64. It was just, it was flawed and it definitely led to bigger problems down the line, but it was still an incredible machine and it was still incredibly popular outside of Japan. And
it was a time where the games you would get in 1 year would completely reshape your understanding of what gaming could do and be. And that is... it has been so long since that was the case. And understand, I'm not saying the modern industry is doing anything wrong. There's no way it could be like that anymore.
No.
But when I think about what was really special and really remarkable about that time, like that was one of the big things.
Yeah.
You know, Hyle, one of the last first-party N64 games released was this bizarre port of Dr. Mario. Now, imagine an alternate timeline where, inexplicably, several years after that, Rare did their usual thing, where they take what Nintendo did and do them one better, and they released It's Mr. Pants 64.
Well then, we wouldn't even have to have this debate, would we, Josh?
The N64 would still be on store shelves to this day.
This has been a File 2 production.
Que rico.